Hi, I'm Old Norse specialist Dr. Jackson Crawford, and if I could pick one location to make videos in, I would pick this one, this amazing high elevation lake where I have 25, 30 trout just in sight swimming in the water right next to me, columbines growing all over the place. It's perfect. But for the Norse, the mountains are a dwelling place of vaguely threatening creatures that are aligned against humans and gods, and which in English translation we often read about as giants and trolls. And I get asked all the time, what is a giant? What is a troll? What is the difference between a giant and a troll? And the reality is, words exactly corresponding to those aren't really used in the Old Norse text, and it's not that clear what they're talking about when they're talking about the things that we usually translate as giant or troll. So in the popular books that people used to learn about Norse mythology from, and in the websites and I guess social media feeds that people learn about it on now, and probably in the AIs that the next generation will unfortunately learn about this stuff from, the words giant and troll occur all the time. And if you go into the Poetic Edda, the collection of 30 or so poems about the Norse gods and heroes, which are our chief source of pre-Christian myth, because most of these poems actually survive an oral transmission from before the conversion of Scandinavia, you actually won't find the word troll very much at all. One of the few places you'll find it is in the poem Voluspo, which is about the creation of the world as well as Ragnarok, when it applies to something very, very different than what we would usually think troll would apply to today. This is in Voluspo stanza 39 in the Konungsbok or Codex Regius manuscript. Auster satt in Altna I Jornviði og föddi þar Fenriskendir. Verður af þeim ollum eina nokkur tungustjugari I Trollshami. The aged one sat in the east in Ironwood, and there gave birth to Fenrir's children. There is a certain one from among them all, a chewer of the moon, in the shape of a troll. So what we're talking about there are demonic wolves, the children of Fenrir, the great wolf that will kill Odin. But we hear elsewhere in Vafthrudnismal, a poem in the Poetic Edda, as well as in Snorri Sturluson's Prose Edda, which for the most part is a 1200s Icelander's attempt to explain these poems, that a wolf will swallow the moon at Ragnarok. So it seems that what we're talking about there, this wolf in a troll's shape, a troll's skin, hamar is the usual word for the physical appearance of a being. It's what you change if you're a shape changer. It appears that that is just a wolf. The wolf in a troll's shape is a wolf in wolfish shape. Troll is not a shape. But this is, again, one of the very, very few places that word even occurs in Old Norse, so it doesn't seem to be implying some kind of particular being. So what could troll mean? It appears to be related to a verb, trilla, which is to enchant, to cast magic. So the troll seems in its most basic etymological sense to be the magical thing, the thing created by magic, perhaps, or the thing affiliated with magic. And Ármann Jakobsson, a very influential and excellent student of these questions, who works at the University of Iceland, has proposed that troll is just a sort of catch-all negative term for the supernatural that is negatively aligned with regards to humans and gods. So if it's supernatural and it's bad, it's a troll. That can mean that a Jotun, right, a so-called giant, an enemy of the gods, that's a troll at the sort of highest level. And on the lowest level, a witch or a wizard is a troll. In fact, note that, for example, in modern Norwegian, if you read Lord of the Rings, you're going to read about Gandalf, who is a trollman, right? That's just the catch-all general word for wizard in modern Norwegian. Trolldom is the practice of magic. So how does it come to mean a particular, ugly humanoid being, especially one that dwells in the mountains, as we often read that they do in, modern folklore from the Scandinavian countries? And here by modern, I mean, post-Protestant Reformation, right? This is not, to say, 21st century. It's not contemporary folklore necessarily. It's just not part of the same culture that produced the Eddas. Well, I think part of what's happened is that the concepts of Jotun and troll have kind of blended over time, and the part of what's happened too is probably some folkloric sense of these big humanoid monstrous beings dwelling in mountains or caves or something coexists with the mythology that we see in the Eddas in the medieval period too. That's just not what they were writing down in Iceland in the 1200s when they wrote down the Eddas. The Eddas are about stories about gods and heroes. They're not about, they're not the stories of common people in the way that folklore is. They're not about the struggles or fears of common people. So we just can't really trace that all that very far back. Now, if troll, the word, barely occurs in the Poetic Edda outside of this one occurrence, I'm not sure that I can find another one. I may be missing something, and I'm much more reliant on hand searching than I am on internet, or computer-based searching, so maybe there's one occurrence or two that I've missed, but I don't think so. If that word doesn't occur in the Old Norse text of the Poetic Edda, why does it occur in my translation of the Poetic Edda or in other people's translations? In fact, it even occurs in the second edition of my translation of the Poetic Edda, due out in September, which I have heavily revised for the sake of accuracy and consistency and new and improved understanding on my part of these texts. Well, I still think that it's a useful term to translate the sort of other catch-all negative terms for supernatural beings that we see all the time in the Eddas. One of the most prominent is actually gramir or grom, the plural adjective that just means like fierce, terrible, monstrous, because very often the curse is used in the Eddas. May the gramir have you, the grum have you, may the fierce ones have you. Clearly what's meant is that some evil supernatural being is going to have you, and we might as well use a word in English without me having to introduce yet one more Old Norse word in this translation than I already have to, that people are familiar with and that is Scandinavian connotations, and that's troll. But again, that's not really a word that we actually see very much. Let me pause for a moment and remind you that a lot of videos that I have made and posted in recent months were made in Sweden, and in particular at the archaeological site of Birka. And it was because the people who run Birka and Grimfrost brought me to Sweden that I was able to make all those videos, including the one at the Sparlösa Runestone and many at the Birka site itself. There are these little pins with the Birka rider that you can buy to support the archaeological site at Birka, and which will help them maybe eventually excavate the thousands of rich Viking Age burials that are still unexcavated on that island. It still boggles the mind. Supposedly those will be available to purchase on Linda Volander's website at some point before too long. And you can support my channel if you're interested in good free information about Old Norse that comes from a person with expertise in it and not from an AI that just Googles for you. You can help by going to grimfrost.com and buying some of their amazing replica Viking stuff and books, including my books. All right, so what kind of words are used in the Eddas for these supernatural beings that often get translated giant and troll? Well, the typical word for the enemies of the gods is Jotun. And it is utterly unclear what exactly a Jotun looks like relative to a god. It appears that they look like humans, just like gods look like humans, because Freyr in the poem For Skirness looks into Jotunheimar, it's usually discussed in the plural, the homes of the Jotuns, and sees a woman there, Gerður, who is so beautiful that he just falls helplessly in love with her. And it seems very unlikely that she is different in appearance or size from him, if that is going to be the case. And they do marry, so how could they be that different in size, right? She is not a giant relative to him. Now, the word giant gets used for Jotun, I think, because early translators into modern languages in the 18th and 19th centuries were analogizing the enemies of the gods, the Jotuns, to the enemies of the Olympian gods, the Titans. And so they thought that giant seemed like an appropriately, highfalutin term even, versus the original term Jotun, which really appears to mean eater, right? It is related to the English word eat. You see many words in Old Norse that start with J's, that start with E's in English, and that's because of a regular sound change. What we often represent as EA in English usually becomes something represented as JA or J-O hook in Old Norse. So compare earth to jord, compare heart to hjarta, and compare eat to the first syllable of jot, Jotun. Now, there's also the verb etta in Old Norse or in Swedish that doesn't have that J appear. It's because the environment doesn't cause it typically in the infinitives of verbs, but it does elsewhere, although it wouldn't be impossible to find a verb form, yata, yota, some dialect somewhere. But at any rate, they are eaters, devourers. Does that mean they're cannibals? Does that, human eaters, does that mean that they have enormous appetites? I think that both of those are pretty plausible explanations for why they might originally just be called the eaters, but the name does not imply great size. We might also remember that in the Prose Edda, which in a lot of ways is not a primary source, but is a really, really good old secondary source, Snorri Sturluson tells the story of the great builder who makes the wall around Asgardr for the gods, because the gods can't do it themselves. They have to have someone from the outside make a wall that's strong enough to keep the Jotuns out, and they don't realize that the guy who's doing it is a Jotun. So there's nothing in the size and scale and appearance of your default Jotun that implies that it is something different from a god, or maybe even different from a human. It is possible that gods and Jotuns on the whole are bigger than we are, but that doesn't seem to be very consistent either, because Odin and Thor, for example, appear among human beings and don't seem to be notable for being impossibly large. Of course, it's a lot of dream logic and myth, something that can be regarded as, the size of a mountain in one story might be the size of a normal man in another story, but it doesn't seem that size is a defining characteristic of any of these beings. All right. Also, at the very beginning, Snorri, again, says that the first living being who is sort of dripped by, he comes into being, he's dripped out of poison drops, which varð mans líkandi, became in a man's likeness, og var svo nefndur Ymir, and that one was named Ymir. And Hrímthursar kalla hann Árgelmi, and eru þaðan komnar eftir Hrímthursar. But Hreim Thorsar, Frost Thorses, call him Aurgelmir, and the families of the Hreim Thorses have come from there. Elsewhere, this being is called a Jotun. So it looks like a Jotun and a Thors are maybe the same thing. But then what can we say about the word Thors? If troll is related to magic and Jotun is related to eating, Thors may actually be related to, interestingly enough, the same root as is in English, storm. Proto-Indo-European roots in Proto-Indo-European, the ancestor of most languages of Europe, and India and Iran and a lot of the world in between. Proto-Indo-European roots have S mobile, so some of them have S mobile. That means an S that appears or doesn't appear in the root, and we don't know why it appears sometimes and doesn't appear sometimes. But for example, English thatch and Icelandic thak, meaning roof, and the Greek root stego for root that's in like for roof that's in like stegosaurus, roof lizard. That is a root with S mobile. The S appears in Greek, but not in the Germanic words and not in the Latin word toga, which is from the same root. So storm is a Germanic word. It's in English storm. It's Old Norse stormar that has the S and the S mobile. And then Thors is formed with a different root extension. The root is something like ter. That doesn't have S mobile. It looks like this is an old root for like noise or violent movement based on some of its other cognates. I mean, for example, we've got Greek, I believe otreros is from this root, which means fast. There's Greek turbe, which means noise. There's Sanskrit root turd, that means fast. There's Latin turbo, which means storm. So all of these imply that the original meaning is either fast moving or noisy, something like that. Now the Thors word appears to be more resolutely negative in the Poetic Edda. When something is called a Thors, that's bad, even relative to other Jotuns. So again, turning to the poem Forskirnes, where Freyr falls in love with a Jotun woman who is never called a Thors, his servant Skirnir threatens her throughout this poem with all the things that he's going to do to her if she doesn't marry Freyr. And among those things, he twice threatens that he is going to make her have unwanted sexual encounters with a Thors, which one time he also describes as a Jotun. So a Jotun and a Thors are, by implication, the same thing, or a Jotun can be a Thurs, or a Thors can be a Jotun, or vice versa. But Thors seems to be the more negative word. Now, Jotun and Thors occur much more often in the Poetic Edda. We see Jotun all the time, right? We find it in at least 6 stanzas by my, rough hand count in Voluspa, for example, used more or less as a kind of, neutral term for the being. Jotun seems to be classificatory. You're a Jotun or you're not a Jotun. Thors seems to be an insult, right? Thors is something, is a bad kind of this, maybe an ugly kind of this in particular, because, for example, in Forskirnes, Skirnir mentions one that has 3 heads. In Hemiskvida, another very old poem, Tyr's grandmother, who is one of these, has multiple heads. And then some of the ones that chase Thor and Tyr out of Jotunheimar, right, the homes of Jotuns, so Jotuns and Thors, again, looking like the same thing, have multiple heads. So, okay. Then we have even more negative words that occur in the Eddas for beings of this kind or some other kind. Again, it's difficult to see what the relations of all these beings are. Let me read you another little passage from Snorri where he's working on the basis of something in the poem Voluspa. He says, Djögar ein byr fyrir austan Midgard í þeim skógi Jornviður heiti. Í þeim skógi byggja þær trollkonur Jornviður heita. In gamla Djögar föður att sonum marga jotna och alla I vargslikum. So here, this is one of, I think, 2 occurrences of troll in even the prose Edda and Gylfaginning, which is, again, a later text, and Snorri seems to have a somewhat freer understanding of what all these beings are. But look how many different terms for beings get mixed in here. A gigur, this is a term for a female negative Jotun or Thurs, dwells east of Midgard in the forest that is called Jornvidr, Iron Wood. So again, we're talking about that stanza that I quoted early on. This is what his basis is. In that forest dwell those troll women, troll koner, who are called the Jornvidr, iron witches or something like that, potentially. Vidur looks like another word that could mean negative, supernatural, Jotun or Thorson female. The old Giger gives birth to sons, many Jotuns, and all of them in the form of a wolf. So a Giger is a trollkona, is a Jotun, but her children can be Jotuns who are all in the shape of a wolf, right? So even Jotun, this classificatory term for the beings that are enemies of the gods, embraces ones that are not humanoid, right? Now, what is Giger from? This may be related to a Lithuanian goddess named Guje. What exactly this root is, hard to say. There's at least old Lithuanian Gujte that means protects. So it could be something to do with, it could be an old protective deity name that's been repurposed to something negative. You also sometimes see something that looks a little bit like this, but is etymologically unrelated, Giver, for these evil, ugly Jotun women. That probably means greedy or voracious. That's at least what the adjective means in Old English. But having run through all this, Giver, Guger, Jotun, Thors, Troll, I am not certain that the people composing these poems had consistent ideas about what any of these meant. I think that they had a very vague notion that there is supernatural evil in the world that takes humanoid forms, takes non-humanoid forms, and they're not writing monster manuals. They don't need to give you what the attributes of these things are. They don't have specific lists of objective abilities that they have or spells they can cast or things like that. They sort of have the abilities they need for the given story that they're in. And sometimes evil takes a very human form, and then sometimes evil takes a form that's natural but animal. A wolf being sort of the classic example of that, or a serpent, for example, with Jormungandr, or one of the dragons, like Nidhogger. And sometimes it takes a very monstrous form, probably especially in stories that were intended more for children or for straight entertainment, or that originate in stories told for entertainment at sort of a more folkloric stratum. Again, the stories that do survive in the Eddas tend to be stories about kings and their ancestors, which is probably most of how we have stories about the gods surviving, is the notion in early medieval Scandinavia that's already Christian, but still sort of can vaguely accept that, all right, well, these are, not really gods, as far as someone like Snorri is concerned, but we can still legitimate some interest in them as the ancestors of royal families and significant historical personages. Anyway, well, take what you will from that, but in my translation, the second edition of the Poetic Edda, I have taken Jotun and Thors, and instead of translating them giant, or sometimes even troll like I did in the first edition, I have consistently translated both of those words as just Jotun, right, to give you something that reflects a pre-Christian medieval Scandinavian idea of what these things are without imposing the word giant. I really hate the word giant in English translation because, again, the size of these beings is not what's important, not relative to us and not relative to the gods. And then I've used troll in the few places that troll is used, but also for gramir and grom, these sort of generic evil supernatural beings, and then troll woman for gugur, giver, because those terms seem to be especially for evil women of this kind. But that really also borders very closely on witch. It's not always clear that a gigur or giver isn't a human woman who has become considered something like this because of her supernatural witch-like powers, not because she was born one of these. Although Voluspan Skama says that all the vulvas come from one particular ancestor. I want to say his name is Vilmather. So there also could be an old notion that all witches are related to each other, right? Maybe witches are sort of a family. Maybe the Jotuns or Thorsar are a sort of family of wizards or witches, just at a higher level, the gods level. Whereas someone like a vulva in one of the sagas of Isenders or one of the mythical heroic sagas is a witch at a more human stratum. You see how much potential confusion there is here. What's the difference between a giant and a troll? What the hell is a giant? What is a troll? And what words do you mean in the original Old Norse texts? I always think that as confusing as those original Old Norse texts may be, it is better to try to understand them than to try to impose our classifications and our words on the texts of people who didn't think like we do, especially didn't think in terms of classifying things the way that we want to classify them for the purposes of games or modern storytelling. All right, well, that's enough for now. I appreciate the folks at Birka, appreciate the folks at Grimfrost, appreciate the folks on Patreon supporting this channel, those of you on the Scald tier getting monthly updates, Zoom calls with me where you get to look at my work on the prose Edda. There's one of those big trout. And for now, from extraordinarily beautiful Colorado, please know that I'm wishing you all the best.